Hi, my name is Luke Thompson. I'm excited to share my testimony with you all today. For those of you who don't know me, I'll give you some background on my life. I'm 28 years old and I grew up here at Richland Alliance Church. Both of my parents are strong believers and still attend this church. I'm the oldest of four siblings and I have two younger brothers and a younger sister. I accepted Christ at a young age, praying with my mom, and I always believed that God was real, but I wasn't really willing to surrender my life to Him until much later. A couple other things to know about me are I played competitive tennis most of my life, and my goal for most of my childhood was to become a professional tennis player. I was homeschooled before elementary school, in middle school, and a little bit in high school. I attended church and youth group all the way through high school, but my faith did not become a priority for me until college. So most of my faith journey starts in college, so that's where I'm going to start my story. There are three main themes in my testimony. The first one is that God pursued me, especially in college, but throughout the rest of my life as well. The second is that God has grown me in His good ways. And the third is that God has given me strength to persevere through some really difficult circumstances. As I go through my story, I'll share examples of how each of these things have happened in my life. So after graduating high school, I got a scholarship to play tennis at Eastern Washington University, which was the last choice of 7 or so schools that I wanted to go to. Honestly, I shouldn't have even gone to college. I didn't really care about the school part. I was just there to play tennis, and I still wanted to play tennis professionally. My parents encouraged me to get involved in a Christian ministry, and I did, although the first group I got involved with, I think it may have been a cult. It was really weird. Unfortunately, my first year at college was a disaster. I had a very painful relationship with a girl, and I was academically ineligible to play tennis for most of the year because I had a hard time getting my credits approved through the NCAA. The worst time was around Christmas when the girl that I liked told me she was going to stay with another guy. I remember coming home around Christmas time in the darkest depression I'd ever been in. This is the part of my story where I pull out the first theme, and that is that God pursued me when I was in college. After I came back from school from Christmas break, I met up with a guy named Jason Randalls, who is the head of the athletic side of Cru, which is formerly known as Campus Crusade for Christ. He invited me to come to an athlete's Bible study and attend the weekly Cru campus meetings. This was the start of God pulling me towards Him. Towards the end of the year, Jason told me about something Cru did called a summer project. Basically, it was a 10-week camp in Lake Tahoe where students lived together and learned how to be disciples of Christ. When Jason told me about this, I didn't give it much thought because I assumed there'd be no way I could go. I wasn't even that interested in it. The two biggest barriers were I had to raise a couple $1,000s for the trip, and I needed to work for the summer. I believe that God opened the door for me to go because I was able to raise the money, some of it from my roommate who was not following Christ at the time, and actually quite a bit of it from people who attended this church. I also found out that students were required to work a full 30 or more hours a week while we were there. Everything kind of fell into place with very little effort on my part. And I really believe that God played a big part in bringing that all together. The Lake Tahoe trip was awesome. If you ever get a chance to go there, do it. It's an incredibly beautiful place. There were probably close to 100 college students ranging from Washington to Florida that were there, in addition to about 40 staff members. I got a job as an assistant tennis coach at a local high school, and I got to bike up a mountain every day to get there since I didn't have a car. There's so much that happened during this trip that I could share, but there's a few takeaways that stand out. First, I got to be involved in a small group for the first time in my life. I love being able to get to know people on a deeper level, and I met some really awesome guys in the group. Honestly, everybody at the camp was so loving. I'd grown up around Christians, but since I hadn't had many deep relationships with them, this was some of my first encounters with people my age that were really walking with Christ. It changed me to see that because it made me want to be like them. The second thing I learned was that a relationship with God was supposed to be a relationship. I'm sure I'd heard that before, but it never clicked with me until then. I hadn't really understood that God loved me, even though I'd heard that before. I kind of thought of him more as an authority figure who had a bunch of rules that I was supposed to follow. Seeing how the people around me acted was really powerful in helping me to understand the concept of a relationship with God. The third takeaway from Tahoe was that I got put outside of my comfort zone a lot. I'm not an extrovert by any means, and growing up, my pride and insecurity led me to be a very unsocial person. We were required to go engage people in conversations on the beaches and trails, and we were also encouraged to build relationships with our coworkers. One powerful experience I had was with a coworker named David, who taught tennis with me. So he was a nice guy, but right out of high school, he was an alcoholic and he smoked marijuana all the time. I remember one day hanging out with him, and we were talking about life and faith, and I remember we sat down on a bench and the sprinklers came on, and he was so intoxicated. It was like he didn't even know that the sprinklers were on. He was so messed up. So we had a lot of conversations in the time that I was there. I don't know how much he actually remembered, but he was one of the first experiences I had sharing Jesus with someone else. And his life was kind of a mess, but it was really a cool experience for me to get to know somebody that was very different and share my faith with him. So also at the camp, I started hanging out with people a lot more. I used to stay in my room and play video games because I was pretty uncomfortable in social situations. Over time though, I ended up giving my computer to one of my buddies for the rest of the trip, and so I didn't have that excuse to isolate myself. God was starting to change who I was. Also on the trip, I lost some money from an academic scholarship at Eastern, and I didn't know if I'd be able to go back. So I called my tennis coach and he raised my scholarship. And I believe that this was a God moment because I hadn't hardly played the previous year and my coach didn't have much reason to raise my scholarship. So that was pretty cool. My second year at Eastern was much better than the first. I got to play tennis. I met my best friend at college, and I was attending crew meetings regularly. I was growing in my faith and nothing too difficult happened that year. My third year is where everything fell apart. I met a girl on the women's tennis team who was not a Christian and got into a complicated and emotionally unhealthy relationship with her. We also got a new tennis coach who was verbally and emotionally abusive towards me and towards our entire team. My electrical engineering classes were getting overwhelming, and I also started developing OCD symptoms, although I didn't realize what that was at the time. I'd been on a really good trajectory with my faith the previous year, and I had an awesome opportunity to witness to people on my campus and be a leader on my tennis team. When I started dating this girl who was not a believer, I started drifting away from God. I knew that this relationship wasn't a good idea, but I stuck with it anyways, hoping I could convince her to become a Christian. If anyone out here is in a relationship with an unbeliever considering one, don't do it. The constant tension of hoping she would change and knowing that it was wrong to date her practically drove me insane. In the last quarter of my junior year, my brain couldn't handle it anymore. All these factors with the girl, school, the coach, and OCD just became too much for me to handle. I remember waking up one day and it felt like someone had flipped a switch in my brain. I had a pounding in my head and in my chest, and I just felt like I had to escape school and get out of there. I tried to tough it out that day, but it just kept getting worse, and I ended up leaving class and calling my parents while I was shaking in bed. You know how when you break a bone, sometimes it's like a fracture, it's not too bad. Sometimes it's a serious break, and then sometimes people shatter a bone. To me, I would say I kind of shattered my brain. It was very serious what happened to me. I quickly realized I was going to have to drop out of school, and I got put on an anti-anxiety medication that caused me to sleep for 12 or more hours a day. I ended up being in bed for almost 8 months straight, and I was hardly able to leave my room because my anxiety levels were so high. Taking a step back from all of this for a second, I believe that despite my mistakes at school, the main one being pursuing that relationship, God used this crisis in my life to pursue me further. As I started to function a little better at home, I did a lot of deep thinking about my situation. Every day was still incredibly painful. When I journaled about my life, I referred to every day as my daily torture. It was so painful, even just laying in bed most days, and I didn't know if I wanted to continue living. Additionally, it felt like I'd lost everything. I had this picture of what I wanted for my life. I wanted to move forward with tennis and get my degree, and it felt like my future was ruined. It was in this time when I felt like I'd lost everything, where I was forced to confront my belief in God. The decision I had to make was simple. Either I believed God was real and decided to live with the intense pain that I live with every day and deal with it, or I could give up. I don't know if I would have actively tried to end my own life, but it might have been more just losing the will to keep living or try to get better. During this time, I got involved with a small group Bible study at home with some of my friends, and through a process of prayer, conversations with those guys, and a lot of deep thinking, I finally decided to really surrender my life to God. I think for me, losing so much was actually really helpful or even necessary to take my faith seriously. My life had always been about myself, and I was never willing to let God take control and actively follow what he wanted to do. There was a new king on the throne of my life. Lots of changes happened for me during this time. One significant change was that I got put on a medication that allowed me to function better. I started exercising, socializing a bit, and I also joined a young adult group in Kennewick and eventually got involved there. This is where the second theme of my testimony comes out. I believe that God pursued me, and then after I decided to surrender my life to him, he started to grow me in his good ways. Psalms chapter 1, verses 1 through 3 captures this theme well. It reads, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers." The idea here is that when you walk with God, your life flourishes like the tree planted by the stream. It is important that I clarify, though, that by flourishing, I do not mean that God takes your problems away. That certainly did not happen for me. What I do mean, though, is that I started to change how I lived and how I thought. I could really see myself becoming a new creation. Again, there are many examples that I could give of how God has grown me in the past 7 years since I left school, but I'll focus on a few. Like I said before, I started going to a new church at home, which is great for me because it helped me to make my faith my own. I forced myself to meet people, and since the church was a church plant, there was always a lot of work to do. I remember within the first, 3 weeks I was there, somebody came up to me and asked me how I wanted to serve. And I just remember that was such a weird thing to me. I never really thought about serving in church before. So I actually ended up becoming a youth leader at my church. And it was a great experience for me. It helped me to realize that I like working with kids a lot. It grew me in my own faith. And it was just really fun. I really enjoyed it. My fellow leaders were also young adults, so I got to grow closer to young adults as a result of that experience. And through all of this and serving at this church, it helped me to realize that being part of a church is more than just attending, but it's helping out and building relationships with people. Another way God grew me was through teaching tennis. If you'd asked me in high school or even college if I would ever teach tennis, I would have definitely said no. In fact, the director at Columbia Basin Racquet Club offered me the job at least once, where I turned him down, and I just wasn't interested in it. But after praying for a while about where I should go, it became clear to me that teaching was the way to go. My job at CBRC ended up being exactly what I needed at that time in my life. My boss became a great friend to me and a mentor, and he wanted us to be excellent at our work, but he also was kind and patient and encouraged me to grow and make mistakes in the process. One funny memory I have is we had to do work on these clay tennis courts that we have out there every year. And part of that work was removing the top layer of clay that we had and carting it off. And we used a lawnmower to do that. So I wanted to learn how to use the lawnmower. And so my boss was like, okay, go ahead. And so I unfortunately learned that if you drive a lawnmower with a heavy load at a diagonal, it's really bad for the lawnmower. So I ended up actually basically breaking the whole thing. That one of the wheels or the tires like exploded or something. And I got to do the rest of the job by hand, so that was fun. But the best part of that experience was my boss wasn't upset with me. Like, he understood that when you're doing something new, you'll make mistakes. And this was totally opposite to the toxic coach that I'd had my last year at school. Through the job that I had at CBRC, I learned how to lead adults. I learned that I love working with people. I learned that I love coaching. And all of these are skills that I never would have known that I could have if I hadn't have tried this job. And it started to change the perception of my identity that I had as a tennis player my whole life growing up. So when I accepted the job at CBRC to teach, my anxiety levels were really high. And I didn't think I could take on a full-time position, but I decided to trust God with it and just go for it. The teaching was hard, but my brain was way harder to deal with. And I'm not usually a super emotional guy, but I remember there were day after day where I would drive to work and just be crying in the car beforehand because the anxiety was so intense. It felt like my brain was telling me, you are going to die if you go in and you work today. And I had to face that day after day after day, and that was horrible. And when I say I felt like I was going to die, I'm not exaggerating. That's how, as I'll explain later, that's how OCD works. It really feels real. Thankfully, over time, the anxiety went down and the teaching got easier. But this leads to the third theme, which is that God has given me perseverance to endure a lot of pain. Since everything happened to me in college, I've been diagnosed with treatment-resistant OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, and PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. As you can guess, treatment-resistant means that the treatment hasn't been very effective so far. I've worked with 4 different counselors, seen multiple doctors, and tried many different treatments, and none of them have been very helpful. The main problem I have is I have physical symptoms that are caused by the emotional and mental difficulties that I have. I've been living in a constant state of what's called hyperarousal for 7 years now. And basically that means that your nervous system isn't working correctly and you're constantly stuck in fight or flight mode. And one of the hardest parts about that, probably the hardest part, has been I've been hyperventilating for 7 years straight without stop. And that's been really tough. Most people think of hyperventilating as gasping for breath, like you're having a panic attack. And initially that's what it was like for me, but then after it just goes on for forever, your body just starts to get used to it. So I've learned how to live with it. You look at me now and I'm not gasping for breath, but I have this underlying level of just hyperventilating going on all the time. And it makes me weaker, and it's just horrible. It feels really bad. So the other thing is my whole body just has a lot of muscle tension. Part of having post-traumatic stress disorder is that my body doesn't process emotions correctly. So I get these negative emotions that come up, and instead of me being able to feel them normally and them leaving, they stick with me and cause these muscles to tighten up, and it's super frustrating and uncomfortable. Unfortunately, so after about 1.5 years of teaching tennis, my mental health symptoms started getting worse, and I didn't know why. I continued to work for another year, through increasing anxiety and physical symptoms, but eventually it became too much for me to handle. I'm not just talking about a small amount of anxiety. I'm talking about anxiety that was crippling. It made it harder for me to breathe, hard to walk, and just do basic things in life. That was about two and a half years ago. Since then, I've tried different therapies to treat my health issues, and none of them have been very successful. Last year, around March or April, I became bedridden for about 9 months in a row. A simple explanation of how this happened is OCD and PTSD trigger me when I do certain things, and it causes negative emotion. The way you're supposed to treat this is by exposing yourself to the things that trigger you, and kind of keep going despite how it makes you feel. I made probably 30, probably even more attempts than that to try to push through and try to confront the things that were triggering me. And every time I would do it, I would get overwhelmed. It truly felt like it was impossible to push through the amount of pain that I faced. I did not think it was humanly possible. The other thing is, with these triggers that I was getting through OCD and PTSD, things that did not used to trigger me started to. It started to spread. And so like something like reading a book started, my brain would tell me like, if you read this book, like this is too much for you. You cannot handle this. And it just started taking over my life. It felt like my brain was like slowly taking over my life and trying to kill me. I've read stories of people who have OCD who actually get to the point where they cannot eat anymore, or they feel they cannot eat anymore. So I'm thankful that it never got to that point for me, but it was really bad. So this situation really tested my faith. I don't understand why God allowed me to lose a great job, my health, my ability to serve in church, and just my ability to function as a human being. I prayed every day for God to bring healing through my doctors or counselors, or just to bring a miracle. As the months dragged on, I had no idea where God was in all of this. It reminds me of the story of Job, where so many bad things happened to him, in addition to his friends accusing him of sinning and doing things he hadn't done. So Job's defending himself before his friends, and he wants to argue his case before God. But when God finally shows up, he never actually tells Job why the things that happened to him had happened to him. Instead, God challenges Job's thinking. So in chapter 38, verse 1 through 5 of the book of Job, it reads, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, 'Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined it? Surely you know.'" God is reminding Job that his understanding of the world is minuscule in relation to God's own understanding. After a period of this questioning, Job repents, and he's greatly humbled by this experience and realizes he's spoken of things that he didn't understand. The story is comforting, even though it's terrible, because God is reminding Job that he doesn't see the big picture like God does. God has a plan, and sometimes really bad things happen, and we may never know why. Our lives are less in control than we think they are. Despite all of this, Job did not give up, and he didn't lose his faith. God gave him the strength to persevere, and Job did, and eventually God blessed him and restored him. I can say that in everything I've been through so far, I've had this inner strength from God that has helped me to keep going no matter what. There's been so many times where I've gotten hopeful to get better through a new treatment, and it just hasn't happened. And it's kind of felt like I get my hopes up and then it doesn't work, and it's like just getting punched and knocked down over and over and over again. But God has given me the strength to keep getting up and keep trying. So there's several practical ways that God provided for me to keep going through all these things. And one of them is being able to live at home and have family support. One of them is also through my small group community, which has been great, just having those guys praying for me and communicating with me. And the other one is through my mentor that I meet with on Skype every week, who actually used to be a youth pastor here. His name's Greg Collard. And he's been a constant source of encouragement and prayer, and he's been a really impactful person in my life. I'd also been saving up a lot of money before I stopped working, and that helped me to be able to cover the high medical bills that I've had. So a couple of verses I wanted to leave you with, and these verses have been helpful for me through this time. I'd actually recommend everybody memorize these verses. One of them is Proverbs 3, 5 through 6, which says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path." This has been helpful for me because a lot of what's happened to me has been outside of my understanding. The other verse is Philippians 4, 6 through 7, which says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." So obviously, anybody who deals with anxiety issues, this verse is helpful for. So to wrap things up, there is some good news. I've been out of bed and fighting the triggers that I deal with for 170 days now. I'm working again and taking a class at WSU Tri-Cities and playing tennis again. So kind of getting my life back, and that's really awesome. Praise God for that, because like I said, I was convinced it wasn't possible. I've been able to make this progress through working with an excellent doctor in Hermiston, who actually happens to be a Christian guy. And he helped me make that breakthrough. And it was another, what I would call a God moment, where he just told me exactly what I needed to hear to do the thing that I thought was impossible. There's also been a few times where I've gotten significant relief from my symptoms, and I don't understand how or why that happened, but the fact that it's possible is a source of hope. If you take anything away from my story, it's that God is faithful to walk with us through our struggles. When talking about the hardships he faced in ministry, Paul says in Philippians 4:13, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me," which is actually what my shirt says. I don't know if you can see it. So thanks for your time, and I hope that God uses my story to encourage you in some way.